So good morning, welcome. This is part 2 of what makes an organ and organ. And last week we looked at pipe organs and the evolution of pipe organ technology and how that's all worked out. And then today we're going to be looking at mostly electronic organs, how those came about, and other types of organs that were designed to be substitutes for the pipe organ because, quite frankly, pipe organs always were and always will be extremely expensive and take up enormous amounts of space. So, as always, let's start with a little music, but first I want to remind you to please check out the links in the video description. We have ways for you to send me a tip for enjoying the show that I've put together here for you. You can go through Venmo or PayPal. You can also go and take a look at my Patreon page if you want to be a regular supporter. Big shout out to all of those patrons who are giving me their regular support. That is extremely helpful and keeps me in a position to be able to do these shows each week. Also, be sure to sign up and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you haven't already, and be sure to like my Facebook artist page so you can see what I'm up to, especially when we get back to in-person performances, so you can come see me, and I'd love to see you as well. So, music today. I'm going to play two pieces. The first is called the Agincourt Hymn, and this goes clear back to the early Renaissance, and you'll notice that it is very regal and Renaissance sounding. And then I'm going to play an Adagio that is attributed to a composer named Marcello, and is arranged by Johann Sebastian Bach. And then, of course, I'm playing my arrangement of the Bach arrangement, so it's kind of an arrangement of an arrangement. But a lovely, lovely piece indeed. So here we go. As I was playing there, I realized I didn't switch to my better shot here. I now have two camera angles. There we go. This is more fun for watching me play. So now the Bach Marcello Adagio. I stumbled on a recording of that, and I just thought it was so lovely, and it was kind of perfect for adapting to the organ, so I did it. There you go. So, alternatives to the pipe organ. Well, we kind of have to get ourselves into maybe a working definition of what makes an organ, and the problem is that at this stage of the game, you know, lots of things are called an organ, and there's actual active controversy about what we call an organ and what we don't call an organ, and that's going to be part of today's show. But if we're looking at what is traditionally known as an organ, we of course have to look at the pipe organ and how it goes together. And from there we can kind of develop a definition based on that. And then we can look at the pipe organ substitutes and kind of look at, well, how do they measure up and how do they maybe not? And then we'll look at the evolution of those alternative organs. Well, strictly speaking, if we're going to look at an organ like this, it's a multi-timbral instrument. I have a couple different keyboards, and I have lots of different voices, and these draw knobs select those voices. So, and the voices appear at different pitches, if you noticed. Here's concert pitch. So this middle C is the same as you would find on a piano. This note, if I pull this stop, I'm actually playing the note an octave higher. If I pull this one, that's an octave still, a fifth above that, the highest, and then there's another mutation. Well, this sequence here follows what's known as the natural harmonic sequence, and that's important to understanding the pipe organ substitutes and electronic organs. Pipe organs did that from the very beginning, but they would do that with separate ranks. So you'd have a rank of pipes at normal pitch, then at octave pitch, then at the quint pitch, super octave, tiers. And with that, you can synthesize different colors. The idea is that organ pipes were naturally kind of weak in upper partials, whereas an instrument like the violin or the human voice is very rich in upper partials. And so to kind of fill that in, you combine stops of different pitches to get a more complete sound. And we'll look at that a little more as well. So, like I said, pipe organs are always these big, huge, expensive things, and so it was very desirable from the very beginning to come up with something that might be a substitute that would give you an organ tone but wouldn't be so big and cumbersome and so expensive. Now, you've probably seen one of these somewhere in your life, the reed organ. Neil Young actually uses this instrument in some of his music. And basically, it uses the same type of reeds that you would find in an accordion. Essentially, it's a big sit-down accordion in a case. You'll notice that there are draw knobs right above the keyboard, and those call up different voices and features. So like a pipe organ, it is multi-timbral. You have multiple sets of reeds, all at a different kind of voicing so that you can combine things together. You also have different pitches, just like on a pipe organ. But this instrument really didn't serve that well as a substitute organ. This instrument was actually designed specifically to play church hymns. And it's an amusing story how these came about. In the Victorian era, the piano was finally kind of coming into its own, and they were starting to make upright pianos and square grand pianos that could go into people's homes. But a lot of very sensitive Victorian types thought that the piano as a percussion instrument was very gauche, and you certainly couldn't play church hymns on a piano, and only godly music was appropriate inside a Christian home. Now, of course, those same kind of people today listen to certain radio stations and only shop at certain stores. But these organs, these parlor organs as they were sometimes known, kind of came out of that sensitivity and were built specifically to play church hymns on. Now you'll notice it doesn't have a pedal clavier like I play notes with my feet on a real organ. And these were exceedingly popular for a while, and in fact at one point more of these were made in the United States than pianos. This led to the building using the same technology of a true practice organ for the home. And you can see that this has multiple keyboards, it has a pedal keyboard, and this could really serve as a practice instrument. And some of these really make a very impressive sound, the better ones. And you know, if I had space and time, I'd like to have one of these just because they are unique and they are kind of fun. And but this was sort of the first instrument that really gave the organist the opportunity to have a practice instrument at home that they could really rehearse their literature on. But of course, these started to get expensive. Once you put the pedal board on it and some type of either powered air source, or if you were lucky enough to have an obedient child who would, you know, pump the thing for you while you were playing. But at, you know, given the limits of technology in the 19th century, these were certainly a big deal. Now, the first electric organ came about in the mid-1930s, and that was built by a guy named Lawrence Hammond. Now, Lawrence Hammond was actually a clockmaker. Lawrence Hammond had invented the very first synchronous electric motor. And what that meant was that it was a motor that would keep an absolutely dead steady constant speed. This was a big innovation in the early 20th century, and he made the first electric clocks. But then he went about applying that same technology to building a pipe organ substitute, and he invented the tone wheel organ. Well, not really. The idea for the tone wheel organ dates back to a much earlier time in the 20th century, and the first one was just this big, enormous thing. It had these big shafts and these magnets on the shaft, and the idea was that those magnets were going to spin and they were going to drive a speaker coil directly, and this would generate an organ sound. Well, this was more cumbersome and complicated than a pipe organ, and the prototype for it was never really finished, and it was a completely failed project. But Lawrence took the idea behind that and created this. This illustration shows a tone wheel. And this is the heart of what would become the Hammond organ. Now you notice the wheel has serrations on it, and the arrow indicates that it turns. And then there's an electric coil, electromagnetic coil. And what happens is this works just like an electric guitar. When you pluck a string on an electric guitar, you're not so much amplifying the sound of the string itself as the string is imparting a magnetic disturbance onto the electromagnetic coil, and that in turn can be amplified as a tone. And this was the principle that Lawrence Hammond used, and here's a tone wheel generator all put together. And you can see it's a fairly complicated setup. You can see the tone wheels are the orange-yellow wheels with the serrations. And then there's on the upper part of the drawing, you'll see the red wire of the magnetic coils that would pick up the magnetic disturbance off of those tone wheels and generate the tone. The tone wheel organ would become the first truly portable, affordable instrument that you could put in the home. I have an instrument similar to this out in my garage, and I'm going to, I made a little video yesterday because that was easier than bringing the thing in here. So that will give us a better description of what the tone wheel organ was all about. Okay, so we're out here in my garage, and this is a Hammond Colonnade. It was built in the 70s. It's not actually a tone wheel organ. It uses the same drawbar system that the tone wheel organ used, and that's really the meat of the matter when we talk about the Hammond organ, how it works, and why, yes, technically it's not really an organ, but we're also going to see how that's doesn't really matter. So, at any rate, so we have in the original tone wheel organ, you had I think it was 87 tone wheels. There's 61 keys on the keyboard, and there's 9 drawbars that give you 9 different pitches off of that 87 note tone generator. So let's see, 61 keys times 9 drawbars. Obviously some of the tone wheels are being used again and again and again in order to make that work. So let's look at how this works. There's actually just one tone wheel for each of the pitch positions. So here's middle C. But if I pull out the 4-foot drawbar, which we talked about pitches, there's the octave, the quint, the super octave, the tierce, the octave quint, and the 5 for 1 foot. That's the same thing as if I do this. Just going up the keyboard. The purpose of that is that follows the natural harmonic sequence of musical sounds. So the difference between, say, a flute and an oboe is how the harmonics go together. So an oboe, for example, is a strong second harmonic and third harmonic and a very weak fundamental. So if I pull out my 8-foot or fundamental pitched drawbar just a little bit, and I pull out my second harmonic and my third harmonic drawbars all the way, well, guess what? Kind of a believable oboe. Well, what if I want a flute? Well, on a pipe organ, of course, there's a lot of different kinds of flutes. There's the stopped flute, which would have a strong fundamental and a little bit of third harmonic. There's the open flute, which would be strong fundamental and have a little bit of second harmonic. Okay. Now, Loris Hammond's theory was that when you combined stops on a pipe organ, you got the sum total of all the harmonics being produced by the different pipe tones. So if I combine my stopped flute, my open flute, and my oboe, well, that would be the same thing as just pulling out the 8, 4, and 2 2/3 drawbars all the way.
there's the sum total of the three. But you hear how the sound just kind of sits there? And that's because there's no what we call multi-rank ensemble. You see, on a pipe organ, if I pull 3 stops of 3 different voices, I've got 3 sets or ranks of pipes all playing together. Think of it this way. Say I'm going to have a group of singers sing a hymn in church, and I've only got 4. I know that means I got a bass, tenor, alto, soprano. I've got all the pitches, but that's not going to have the same impact as if I have a 40-voice choir where I have 10 voices on each of those notes. And that's the same problem here. And this is what Loris Hammond didn't get. The reason that sound just sits there is because we've only got one tone source. We don't have a multiple rank ensemble like we would inside of a pipe organ. However, given the limitations of 1930s technology, having an organ you could put in your house, a machine that would actually, yeah, it's maybe not technically an organ, but I can play organ music on it. It gives me a nice organ sound. I mean, if we pull a bunch of this out, and I can get something that actually resembles kind of an organ. And most of us would accept that as an organ, right? Well, the pipe organ people, of course, as soon as the Hammond organ was successful and people were buying them up in droves and taking them home, well, guess what? The pipe organ industry caught on to this and said, oh, this is a threat. And so they took Hammond to court over the use of the word organ. And they argued that an organ is a multi-rank instrument and blah, 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 blah. Well, the judge didn't buy any of it. And he said, well, it sounds like an organ to me. And so that's when there was a legal precedent established that if people generally accepted it as an organ, then it was an organ. And so it continued to be called the Hammond organ. Now, Loris Hammond himself just really didn't have much of an ear for music. And so he literally, people that worked for him have told this story over and over again. And I've met some of the people that worked for him in the early days, and they would tell you flat out, the guy had no ear for music. He literally could not tell the difference between a beautiful, massive pipe organ and his little tone wheel machine. To his ear, it actually sounded perfect. So we have this one glaring problem, right? The sound just sits there. We don't have that multi-rank ensemble effect. Well, enter a guy named Don Leslie. And if you look at old rock music videos, you've probably seen this. There's a guy playing a B3, and right behind him is this box, and it's got this spinning thing in it. Well, it's a speaker. And Don Leslie realized 2 things. If you take a speaker and spin it slowly, you get a chorus effect. So now there's some movement in the sound, there's some animation in the sound. We kind of get a hint that, oh, that sounds a little more like there's more than one thing going on. So it kind of simulated that multi-rank ensemble effect by giving you what came to be known as a chorus effect. Now, you guitar players out there, you've seen one of these, right? This is, of course, the Boss CE2 chorus, which does this through phase shifting, gives that similar effect. But you can also, of course, spin it fast and get a much better tremolo effect than was possible electronically in the 1930s. So with the advent of the Leslie speaker, you could have a warmer, richer sound, a nice chorus effect. You could also have a nice tremolo effect that was much more natural sounding than the original all-electronic tremolos that Hammond came up with in the 1930s. And Don Leslie took his invention. It's like, man, I've cracked it. I've turned the Hammond organ into a musical instrument. And so he took his invention over to Loris Hammond and showed it to him, and Loris Hammond got pissed. Oh my God, how dare you suggest that you can improve on my perfect machine? So, nobody wanted a Hammond organ without a Leslie speaker. But Loris Hammond was so pissed at Don Leslie for coming up with it that he refused to allow any dealer selling Hammond organs to also sell Leslie speakers. And the Leslie company was forced to build elaborate adapters to hook the Hammond organ up to their speaker, and Hammond was always fighting back by trying to wire up their organs in such a way that you could not attach a Leslie speaker to it. It was stupid and ridiculous. And this lasted clear up until the late 1960s, when Loris Hammond finally lost control of the company, and the powers that be said, for God's sakes, let's coordinate our efforts with the Leslie company. So this organ has a built-in Leslie speaker so that it sounds more natural. But the whole drawbar idea of just simply taking the fundamental elements of tone and giving the musician the freedom to control them to make different tonalities, that's an awesome idea. And it has lasted to this day. And really, the Hammond organ has become a standard all its own. For rock and jazz music, you can't beat a Hammond organ with a Leslie. It's truly an awesome machine. And I have a deep affection for Hammond organs. And so one of these days I'm going to get my Model A back in here and get it all fixed up. And yes, it will have a Leslie speaker on it.
So in the video, the Model A Hammond that I refer to is the very first. I have one from the very first year of production. It's not in great shape and needs a lot of work. It's currently in storage, but that will be a fun thing that I can show someday down the line. Now, of course, it wasn't very long before somebody figured out another way to generate tone other than the tone wheel, and that would be the oscillator. Now, let's see. Okay, it's here. This is just a quick picture of a single, what's called an LC type oscillator. That ceramic thing on the left side of the circuit board, that gray thing, is a induction coil, and that's what controls the speed of the oscillation and thus gives you tuning. And so the first idea was, of course, to use these to replace the tone wheels. So you had more of a solid state type instrument. But from there, it was pretty much the same thing. The drawbar setup where you could control the loudness of the individual pitches, that was a Hammond exclusive, and so they had the patent on that, so you couldn't do that. But they had similar arrangements that would just allow you to combine pitches to create tones. But later on, the idea of sending the oscillator tone through filters to shape it into different tonalities would pick up. And eventually, oscillator organs got pretty complicated. Here you see the back of an older Rogers instrument, and you have, you can see down toward the bottom, all those gray cylinders. Those are where the oscillators are. And then above that are the filter circuits that shape that into various organ tones. And then on the left is your preamps and tremolos and all of that kind of stuff. So the oscillator organ would take over, with the exception the Hammond Organ Company continued to build the tone wheel organ because it became kind of a standard of its own. It became its own unique thing. But then a number of manufacturers started building oscillator organs, and these took on a whole lot of different forms. You had, I showed you the oscillators where you have an individual oscillator for each pitch. And that's what this organ is that I play each Sunday. This organ was built in the mid-1980s and represents the pinnacle of that kind of technology in terms of building a production instrument. But there was other ways you could use oscillators to generate pitches and then form them into organ tones. This is the tone generator out of a Schober kit organ. And this was something where you would get the circuit board and a bag of parts and a set of instructions, and you would solder this together yourself and then build the rest of the organ. This actually uses a single oscillator to generate all the pitches. So you have the oscillator here, then you have this special IC chip which takes that oscillator tone and converts it into the top 12 musical pitches, and then each of these is a divider that divides those tones into the various musical pitches you need. So here's how that works. Say I'm generating a tone at, I think this is 2 megahertz in this case, that's almost radio frequency range. This breaks that 2 megahertz into the top 12. And then if I take and I divide that note in half, I get this one. If I divide that one in half, I get this one. If I divide that one in half, I get this one, and so forth. And so you have C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, and so forth. And then those pitches are keyed the same way that they're keyed on the Hammond organ. So this thing runs constantly, and then the keyboard opens up a gate allowing the particular pitches necessary for those notes to pass on through, and then those go through a series of filter cards. So here we have the various pitches come in here onto the circuit board. These components then shape that into, in this case, it is a 16-foot Borden, a stop flute. And then the audio output of that goes out to the amplifier. And so you would have one of these cards for all of the stops on the organ. But once again, we're back to that same lack of multi-timbrality. The multi-rank ensemble is not there. Effectively, with this system, we're taking the tone off of a single oscillator, breaking it up into its component parts, and then with all the filter cards, we're reassembling it. If you had enough of these, you would basically turn the whole thing back into the original tone. So while it gave you different sounds on different stops, just like the Hammond drawbar system, it really didn't give you a proper organ effect. Now, in 1958, a guy named Rogers Jenkins and a friend of his named Fred Tinker, who worked at Tektronix in Portland, Oregon, decided to go into the organ business. And their big idea was that an electronic organ should be in direct imitation of a pipe organ. Up to that point, electronic organs were rightly seen as just completely separate instruments. And so they used the oscillators, like I showed you in the picture, and instead of using a single filter card for each of the voices on the organ, they would use a separate filter and keying circuit for each note of every voice. So this is, we have our cromorn, and we have a flute, and we have a diapason. So the oscillators would be patched into this, they would be running all the time, and then when I hit the keys, certain gates would open up and allow the sound of the oscillator to pass through these filters, and then that would go out to the organ's amplifier. So we still are stuck with that. We don't quite have a multitimbral instrument, but there's ways to get around that. This instrument has multiple sets of oscillators, just like a pipe organ would have multiple sets of pipes. Each set of oscillators produces some of the sounds on the organ. And so by combining that all together and putting, tuning things differently, you do get a fairly rich ensemble effect. So we're starting to get a little bit closer to truly imitating a pipe organ. Now today, technology like this is completely obsolete, except for vintage synthesizers that are modeled on vintage synthesizers. And now we're using digital instruments. And digital instruments even more faithfully imitate a pipe organ because you're starting with the actual sound of the pipe organ. The very first digital instruments were introduced in the 70s. And what they did was use a process called additive synthesis. They would actually record the tone of an actual windblown organ pipe. And then they would analyze that on a spectrum analyzer and develop a synthesizer, a digital synthesis parameter for that. And what they had put programmed into the computer was the harmonic content of each of the stops. And so when you pulled a stop, that particular list of harmonics would come up. But again, everything's coming from the same source. You're still not multitimbral. The other method was to use sample playback, where you would directly take a recording of the pipe and put that out. Again, the earlier computer processors couldn't handle all of those being a little bit out of tune with each other and couldn't really produce them as separate things, and so you were still lacking ensemble. And then, of course, little by little, all of this improved, and now we have some companies are still using additive synthesis, some companies are using digital playback, and others are using a process called physical modeling, in which a computer algorithm actually synthesizes the pipe tone. So we have all of this stuff going on, and what is interesting to me is we still have these arguments over what is an organ and what isn't. And they take on ridiculous proportions. There was a group of pipe organ people that got together and decided they were going to absolutely define what was a proper organ and what was not. And of course, it's only a pipe organ that is a proper organ. And so they set forth all of these rigid standards that if you wanted to call it an organ, it had to be this, 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 and this. That went over like a lead balloon, and eventually they softened that up. But you still have this, back and forth over what's what. I don't care, If I'm playing an instrument, can I make beautiful music at it? That's all I give a crap about. I don't care if it's an electronic instrument. I don't really care what kind of technology is being used inside. Can I make beautiful music at it? And that, at the end of the day, is all that really matters. Arguing over whether an electric violin is still a violin is foolish. Can you make neat music on an electric violin? Sure. Just like an electric guitar is different from an acoustic guitar, but you can make marvelous music on both. So, does it really matter? No, it doesn't. There are pipe organs, there are digital organs, there are analog organs, there are tone wheel organs. They're all great musical instruments in their own right. They all have the ability to make amazing music, and that is all that really matters. And at the end of the day, that's what makes an organ an organ. So this week, I sat down and I wrote what for me is a special piece of music. We all have those moments where we lack confidence in ourselves. It might be about our work. It might be about our relationships. It might be about our appearance. But we all experience those moments in life when we just don't feel secure in who we are or what we are. Earlier this year, my wife went through cancer treatment. And while she was in the middle of chemotherapy and it was just beating the absolute crap out of her, she expressed to me this concern that she was no longer attractive to me. And to hear her say that under that situation just absolutely broke my heart. And I tried to come up with words that would give her her confidence back, to let her know that she's always beautiful to me, but I know that my words fell short. And I wrote this music to kind of express that, to me, she always was, she always is, and always will be the most beautiful woman in the world. And perhaps this music can let her know that better than my words could. This is called Beauty Through the Passing Years. Thank you all very much for joining me today. Next week's show is something really special. Next Sunday, the 25th of October, is the 40th anniversary of the passing of Virgil Fox. So I'm going to do a live presentation all about Virgil Fox and his amazing career where he took the organ out of the church, put it into a rock concert venue, and thrilled audiences all across the country. So be sure to join me next week for that. Also, again, be sure to check out the links in the show description. Visit Venmo and PayPal to leave me a gratuity. Visit Patreon if you'd like to become a regular supporter. And be sure to like my Facebook artist page and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week.